Hello everybody, welcome to AI and Data Ethics class. This is the second part of the third lecture, which is on control, autonomy and trust. So we've looked previously at AI and professional guidelines on what we might learn from looking at ethical questions in other professions and how they're dealt with. So we're going to return to this again today to explain a particular issue in relation to control and AI in comparison to other areas. One of the key ideas behind professional ethics in any area is to protect clients, given their relative lack of skills and knowledge, against the professional expertise and power. And it's the professional expertise, of course, that gives professionals their greater power. So a key idea is that professional ethics presupposes professional control over the goods and services that they offer, and mandates that the professional exercises that control over the goods and services to the benefit of their clients, or in the case of medicine, patients. Now, there are various ways in which this control is maintained and which is overseen to make certain that it's used for the benefit of the clients. So, for example, there's standards of education. There's often a requirement that professionals should update their qualification. There are standards such as professional registration and so on. There are also remedies for failure. Now, ideally, of course, we don't want failure to occur, but the remedies for failure are there, and they're also there to try to make certain that failure never happens. So these include legal remedies for the worst cases, or disciplinary measures from professional bodies, deregistration for bad cases, and so on. But there's also standards of information provision to clients and to patients. So, for example, in medicine, we often don't have full knowledge of how a drug works, or we may be using a drug or a treatment where there's a risk attached to it. So there are general requirements, and there's general professional ethics that you wouldn't use a risky treatment unless you would expect certain corresponding benefits from it. But there are also standards of information provision to the clients, so that the clients will understand what the risks are, understand where medical professionals have control, what the extent of their control is, and therefore be able to make a good judgment as to whether or not to go ahead with a treatment or as to what particular treatment to have. But in all of these things I've just been talking about, the case of AI is somewhat different. So that there's no general standard of professional registration for AI. There are various professional bodies, but there's no requirement that you have to, for example, be registered in any way in order to start producing AI. It's not like, you can't just decide to go and build a sort of massive tower block in the middle of a city, apart from the fact you couldn't get planning permission, but you're not allowed to just put a massive building up. You're not allowed to just start building bridges. Oh, I think I'll have a go at building a bridge. No, there are laws and standards stopping you from doing it. But in the case of AI, anybody can just write a bit of AI. So there's the power also isn't simply what individual technologists are doing, what individual people are doing in making in AI. It's not simply a matter of individual responsibility, but there are issues of power and control that us as ordinary individuals and society as a whole have in relation to AI when we look at the big, powerful, international corporations that are producing the AI. So those are two big problems. But critically, there's also a problem of control of AI that even professionals have. One of the key issues that AI is grappling with now is how precisely to maintain control over the AI that's being produced. How, for example, to be able to predict what decisions it's going to be able to make. How, for example, to even understand how the AI that we're using is actually working. And as I've mentioned this before, in relation to the key notion of transparency or explainability or explicability in relation to AI that we'll be talking about later on in the course. So all of this, of course, naturally gives rise to lots of fears about AI. So human control of AI is generally seen as highly desirable. There are frequently calls to have ultimate human control. But while we're on this topic, note, of course, that there are actually those who disagree, who think that AI will provide superior decision-making to humans, at least in some circumstances, or that AI in the future, if we have some artificial superintelligence, then that is going to provide superior decision-making to humans, or that it might do so. But anyway, thinking about the AI that we have now, There are arguments about how we would actually achieve human control of AI, which can get very complex and technical and will depend on the particular case in point. So, for example, here's some of the terminology used. A human in the loop would put a human being at some point of a chain of decision making which involves AI. A human on the loop would give general human oversight of a system, where whilst the AI might be able to manage a decision or an action independently in some way. But in any case, there's widespread, if not total, agreement that human accountability is going to be essential. Because without some ultimate human control, we might find ourselves in this kind of situation. I'm sure you'll all recognise this from a movie of 2001. It's actually a bit of a pity, actually, now that we're in the 21st century. It's a bit of a pity for us because in the 20th century, future dates after the millennium all had this intrinsically really futuristic, spooky feel about them. Now we've passed that point. It's hard to find any particular future year that sounds quite as futuristic as the year 2001 sounded back last century, when actually even when I was a kid, even 1999 sounded pretty sci-fi back in the day. So that's something we've lost. I can't think of a future date that really sounds so sci-fi in that kind of way. Attempts to control machines, or to control imagined machines, have got a long history. So famously, such concerns gave rise to Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, actually extended by him to 4 laws, including a 0th law. So firstly, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders conflict with the first law. A robot must protect its own existence, except where such protection would conflict with the first or second law. And a 0th law, a robot may not harm humanity or, through inaction, allow humanity to come to harm. So Asimov is often criticised because he didn't manage to produce a foolproof set of rules. But actually, if you read his robot series books, the whole point of these stories was that the laws are ineffective and there are always going to be glitches, which is one of the routes to how come he ended up producing a 0th law. So we look at AI through the lens of our own cultures and concerns. So, for example, if you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article about the ethics of AI written by Vincent Muller, in the section on superintelligence, he asks how much of the philosophy of AI is actually about AI itself and how much of it is actually about our myths about AI. He's talking here about myths about how AI might be developed in the future and how our myths of AI shape how we think about what problems might arise or what advantages might arise, what glorious future might await us. There are also many precedents in myth and story showing fears about control of such creatures. For example, in stories of Golem, a mythical being made out of clay, and the story of Frankenstein's monster. And in the description box, I'll put a link to some recent work looking at narratives around AI, where the theme of robots or some alien creature taking control of us is common, and often in a way that shows human overreach, thinking that we could manage something only to find that we've beaten off more than we could chew, such as in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where a command goes completely wrong. So there's a strong precedent of fears of control of AI in myth and in culture. So that often opens up the question as to how much particular cultural influences are impacting upon how we regard AI and how we think about its current and future impact on us and about its ethics. In worrying what might happen if humans produce creatures they can't fully control, we're in many ways mirroring a problem of control that you might say that God had when he created autonomous human beings, us. So this is a still from a Bible Project video of Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden after getting in trouble after disobeying God's command. So you could say this is a problem of control that God had when he created autonomous beings a little lower than the angels, to quote Psalm 8 again. So how much are such fears and thoughts steeped in particular cultural traditions? It's often pointed out that not all cultures have the same fear of robots that tend to be present in the West. Although, do please note that in talking about general fear of robots and fear of control of AI, I'm not overlooking that there are those who herald the use of robots and even herald the development of superintelligent AI. But there's a certain controversy. For example, there's a lot of controversy and concern about proposed use of robotics as care assistants for the elderly or for people with infirmities. But these debates don't seem to be manifesting themselves, for example, in the same way in Japanese society, and this is often attributed to Shinto beliefs. I'm not going to go into that in any detail now. I just want to indicate and to get you to think about the ways in which our own cultural presuppositions, maybe even perhaps a particular blend of science fiction that you happen to like, might influence how you think about ethical issues and dangers about AI, and in particular fears about how well we can control AI. So we're going to look very briefly at superintelligence and fears around it. I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the questions around it where philosophical issues arise. So superintelligence is defined in slightly different ways by different authors, but basically it can be seen as a level of artificial intelligence so high that it's capable of improving itself incrementally to produce still more intelligent AI to give runaway improvement. So in other words, we develop an AI, the AI is cleverer than us, whatever that means. It's so clever it can work out how to make an AI, another little baby AI, if you like, that's even more clever than it, and so on, and so on, and so on. So this could lead to a singularity, which again, the singularity is defined in slightly different ways. The term is usually attributed to Vernon Vinge. It refers to an event horizon beyond which we can't know what things will be like for us. So if an intelligence is so much more intelligent than we are, again, I'm fully aware that there are questions about what exactly that might mean. But if we can imagine that, well, it would be very hard to imagine what kind of world it might be to live in a world with that level of intelligence, and what kind of world such an intelligence might go on to create or mould. So it's hard to know what's beyond the horizon. And if it's hard to know what's beyond the horizon, it's really hard to know what to do about it. By the way, this photograph, which I chose to illustrate this point, is from an area of a Lake District that my kids and I called the Valley of the Shadow of Death, after getting lost and accidentally walking 20 miles by mistake up and down rather steep hills. So we suddenly came across this valley with lots and lots of one side, lots and lots of dead trees cut down, and lots of dying trees on the other side. So it seemed a good photograph here to illustrate the event horizon. And actually we got lost for technology related reasons, because we were following paths through the forest using Google Maps on a phone, and we kept on losing signal. But in addition to that, the map was virtually impossible to follow because it was so inaccurate, because there were so many new paths being put through all the way. Walking paths are being adapted to bike paths and so on and so forth. So I just thought I'd quickly mention that. But we did eventually, this was the downhill path towards John Ruskin's old house by Coniston Water, which is now open to the public and contained a life-saving tea room. So in other words, we don't really know what particular form superintelligence might take. And views on superintelligence vary enormously, both about whether it's possible, whether we could even know that it's possible, how soon it might arise, and what its possible dangers are. But of course, the difficulty in knowing anything about superintelligence doesn't stop people thinking and writing about it. So here's an example of some books. Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers and Strategies is a New York Times bestseller, which is actually quite staggering that it is a New York Times bestseller. It's a very technical, dense book, talking about how superintelligence might develop, how quickly it might develop, and what we could possibly do to try to control and to prevent superintelligence from being a disaster for humanity. Stuart Russell's more recent book, Human Compatible AI and the Problem of Control, is talking exactly about the kind of issues that we're looking at in this lecture in relation to control in maybe more distant future AI. And he looks at the solutions that Nick Bostrom attempts and tries to critique them and to produce what he sees as better solutions. And Max Tegmark's book, Life 3.0, is slightly different to the two of them, but is looking at how AI might develop in the far distant future. Early pioneers of computing also articulated warnings of such a risk. So, for example, Norbert Wiener in his book Cybernetics, and Alan Turing and many others also have suggested that once we create AI, once we create advanced computing, we might lose control of it. Now, people talking about these projections that computing is going to take off and we'll lose control of it, we won't know what to do with it, are often based upon ideas of ever-increasing rate of improvement in AI. So many people express this view in talking about Law's War, which claims that there is a doubling of capacity in computing roughly every 18 months. Now, of course, this is not actually a law. It's not a law like the law of gravity, a law of physics, or it's not like a law in England against eating swans because they all belong to the Queen. It's an approximate generalisation, which some say is actually slowing down, which is observed from the past and works fairly well. But of course, the astute listener will also realise that doubling of computing power is not necessarily the same as doubling of intelligence. So it's developing of superintelligence that we're concerned about here. So there are lots of complex questions to ask about what exactly it's meant by saying that intelligence is going to supersede us in ways that we won't be able to understand it, but it's nonetheless perhaps be able to control us. So the questions that we need to explore include asking what kinds of presuppositions about intelligence and about computing, the notion of superintelligence, and the notion of runaway improvement of AI is based upon, which includes, of course, asking what's meant by an improvement in intelligence and whether AI can really encapsulate everything that we consider to be a part of human intelligence. So some say that there's a slim chance of such superintelligence happening. So, for example, a fairly recent report by the Stanford Institute for 100 Years of AI argues that there's a slim chance of superintelligence actually happening, whereas Stuart Russell, for example, disagrees very strongly with the Stanford report. And some people hail a future that might be superhuman in some way, where we might become superhuman, or perhaps where there might be superhuman AI which perhaps supersedes us, pushes us out of the way. Or perhaps our future might be somewhat bleak. Even if we never get superintelligent artificial general intelligence, I would argue that there are still grave dangers from some of the more basic forms of AI for our human future. But meanwhile, we'll talk about that in a future lecture, but here are some possible future scenarios should something like superintelligence develop. One option, of course, is extinction. Although, of course, it's worth bearing in mind that some people actually think that human extinction would be rather a good idea. For example, the voluntary human extinction movement thinks it would be rather a good idea. Maybe we might somehow be enslaved by superintelligence so that they'll control us in some kind of way. Quite a lot of sci-fi suggests a fear of future enslavement, or perhaps worse than enslavement, maybe we're somehow kept in some sort of semi-animated state or used for food or those kinds of worries. There are fears that we might be replaced, that future creatures will be AI rather than human. But of course, not everyone sees that as being something to be feared. It might seem that humans are just simply a step on the evolution of greater and greater intelligence in the universe. And there are many, many thinkers who actually would herald that. Or maybe perhaps we'll be sort of pampered pets. Maybe that the AI will be benevolent towards us and look after us and give us lots of playthings so that we have all our needs met perhaps and are just sort of entertained all day long. That's a slight variation to some of the more prosaic projections for what might happen if we can manage to use AI to take over a lot of the tasks that we do, where there would be widespread technological unemployment. The question then arises, what should we all do? And some of the questions are, well, don't worry, because AI will be able to sort of write brilliant novels and create lots of films, and we'll just sit around enjoying ourselves. Or maybe we'll somehow be able to harness all this and become masters of the universe in some way. That seems to me to be the least likely, but who knows which of these might be likely. But should we even be working on these issues of possible superintelligence? Here's a quotation from Andrew Ng. I don't work on not turning AI evil today, for the same reason I don't worry about the problem of overpopulation on the planet Mars. To which Stuart Russell has replied that if there's even one person on the planet Mars, it's a question of overpopulation, since there's no food, no water, no air. So perhaps we do need to think about this. So there are disputes about what kinds of ethical problems we should be putting effort and energy into examining, and what strategies we should use to examine them. Are we putting all our eggs in one basket in the ways in which we're thinking about the ethical problems that AI might present? It's interesting to note that Nick Bostrom's concerns about superintelligence are explicitly based upon a consequentialist argument, that the efforts that he's putting into addressing these issues are based upon a consequentialist argument that although the chances of superintelligence happening and running away in the singularity with perhaps consequent disasters for us might be very, very tiny, the gains for trying to control this are very large, perhaps adding up to some kind of glorious future if we do manage to control superintelligence. Perhaps we'll have some absolutely wonderful future, or there'll be some wonderful future for the universe if we develop the kind of superintelligence, the kind of AI that, for example, Max Tegmark envisages, where maybe we might be able to go out and, or the AI would be able to go out and colonize the whole universe with some glorious future of magnificent little intelligent beings all over the place. It's actually quite interesting, isn't it odd when there are quite a lot of divisions when we might, as humans, go out and colonize the universe, or maybe our artificial intelligence descendants might colonize the universe. It's really odd how that kind of colonialism is greeted as the future of the whole human race, when colonialism done by humans as usually has a very bad press. So that might be a good, glorious future. Or on the other hand, we might have an absolutely disastrous future of complete extinction, perhaps of life on Earth. So those who might be pleased that humans are extinct would still be happy if chimpanzees and cockroaches and rats and poisonous spiders and no one are all still having a lovely time without us. But the possibility that a superintelligence might do something which actually produces disaster, completely eliminates life on Earth, is something which few would actually relish. So Nick Bostrom's argument is that even if he can do in his work, even if he can do a tiny, tiny, tiny amount to make the good future with superintelligence more likely and the bad future with superintelligence less likely, then it's worth the effort. Well, and it's obviously worth his effort, because he must have made a massive amount of money by writing his book. So how do these problems with control arise? So there are many, many different versions of a control problem, but one simple way of explaining it, or one simple problem which might arise, is simply misinterpretation of instructions. This is a problem we could have in any computing, indeed actually with any instance where we give instructions to somebody else, as illustrated in this example, which as per usual I've filched off the internet. Here's an example where there would be pretty clear instructions for an adult, or maybe for an older child who's done this kind of test before. There are implicit things which is assumed about the instruction: write these words in alphabetical order, for those who have a background knowledge of what's intended. But to a child, you could easily see how the problem arises. So this problem of control has long been interpreted in terms of instructions to an insubordinate. So somebody who's in some kind of servant role, or you're the one in charge, it all goes wrong. For example, in the story of a sorcerer's apprentice, or the Isaac Asimov stories, very often where instructions to robots go wrong in some ways. In other words, we could also explain this in terms of a problem about how we articulate precisely what it is that we want, and also how we articulate ways in which achieving what we want might not be what we want. In other words, ways in which we might want something, but we don't want it to be achieved in certain ways. There are only certain sorts of ways which we think it's acceptable to try to achieve it. So, for example, or we might articulate something that we want without realizing that articulation of it isn't sufficiently precise to rule out certain disasters, or that maybe if we articulate what we want and we don't have any limitations on it or any further specifications, it's going to lead to something we really don't want. So the example of King Midas, the story of King Midas, where he wished for everything he touched to be turned to gold, is a really good example of that, because everything he touched did indeed turn to gold, including food and including his own daughter. Now, In relation to superintelligence, this problem of control could happen in lots of different areas, but in relation to superintelligence, the problem of how we might specify instructions to superintelligence might be even harder, because the superintelligence might be able to work out lots of things we hadn't thought about, but also would have capacities beyond where we might be able to control it, beyond where we might be able to stop it, or it might be so, if you like, determined to achieve its goals that it might be hard for us to stop it. So in the case of this child getting this test wrong, it's not a particular problem. In the case of, say, a robot, an actual physical robot sort of run amok, we can at the very least, we could kind of shoot it or something, or turn it off the electricity, or wait till the battery runs down. But with superintelligence, those possibilities are more limited. Now, many of you will have heard about Nick Bostrom's famous paperclip example. We give instructions to an AI to a superintelligence to produce a certain number of paperclips, a large number of paperclips, and the superintelligence ends up turning everything in the world, including us, into paper clips. So it's actually worth going into a little bit of detail about why Nick Bostrom thinks this could be a problem. So the reason why it's thought that the superintelligence, well, you might think, well, why doesn't it just stop? So what Nick Bostrom builds into the example is that the superintelligence has got various sub-goals. So one of the goals is to try to overcome uncertainty in the world. So to maximize the paperclips, we want to be absolutely certain that you've actually got enough, so that you're so attempts to put the right goals into computing with various breaks on ways in which we might not want those goals to be produced are pressing for ordinary level goals and in ordinary computing, but are critical, involve deep questions of ultimate values when we're looking at superintelligence. So Bostrom and others who are interested in this problem attempt to work out how we can put the right kinds of values, the right kinds of goals and methodologies into superintelligence, into the AI that we're building now, so that if it runs away and produces runaway superintelligence, if and when this develops, it's not going to lead to disasters. It's not going to kill us or farm us out or turn us all into paperclips. Now, philosophically, this rests upon an interesting assumption that goes right to the heart of major debates in philosophy. What Bostrom describes as the orthogonality thesis, the idea that values are orthogonal to intelligence. As illustrated here, the idea that intelligence is running in one direction and values just runs in a completely different direction, that there's no correlation, there's no necessary or intimate connection between the two. In other words, no matter how intelligent a machine gets, this tells us nothing whatsoever about its values. And Bostrom explicitly argues that we could develop a superintelligence to unimaginable levels of intelligence, but this tells us nothing about what goals that superintelligence might have, what values the superintelligence has, what it's actually trying to achieve. And therefore, we need to somehow make certain that the intelligence will somehow have values and goals which are at least aligned with ours. Now, of course, on that point, you might realise that others would be arguing that human values would be inadequate to this, that human values we have now are the product of our own particular circumstances, and an AI might be able to tell us that what our values should be, or that the values of an AI might be superior to ours in some way. But we're going to put that to one side, because Bostrom's view is what you might say, what's sometimes being called explicitly human-centric, that it's trying to make certain that we don't lose out to AI. So there's a common, but by no means universal assumption that intelligence, which we can think of as reasoning capacity plus knowledge, it's generally assumed in talking of superintelligence that it has a large amount of knowledge of the world. As well as being really intelligent, it knows how to find out facts. So that possessing intelligence, reasoning power and knowledge is a completely different kettle of fish to having values. In other words, there's a gap between knowledge of facts and capacity to reason on the one hand, and values on the other. A gap between fact and values, or if you simply like, a gap between facts and our desires and our goals. So you'll famously find this claim in the work of David Hume, who articulated very, very starkly in this quotation here. "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. 'Tis not contrary to reason for me to choose my total ruin to prevent the least uneasiness of an Indian or person wholly unknown to me. 'Tis as little contrary to reason to prefer even my own acknowledged lesser good to my greater, and to have a more ardent affection for the former than for the latter." The first sentence there, "it's not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger," is precisely sums up the kinds of fears that people have in relation to superintelligence, and relates to, say, the Nick Bostrom's paperclip example, that you wouldn't say it's not contrary to reason for the superintelligence to destroy the whole world in order to produce some stupid little paperclips. The second part, "it's not contrary to reason for me to choose my total ruin than to give a tiny little gain to somebody else," is, you might think, well, maybe it's not contrary to reason. Maybe some people might actually want to do that. You might want to sacrifice yourself for others, even if what the others gain is less than what you lose. But the last one actually is more telling, because you might think this is a certain part of how we might need to sort of, if you like, do the mathematics of morality, or the mathematics of how we work out our goals and values. It's a little contrary to reason to prefer my own acknowledged lesser good to my greater. So that it'd be like preferring to have, say you really want an ice cream, but you prefer to have like just a slice of bread. No, that's not a good example. So that, supposing, for example, you really want to buy a house, but instead of which you just buy a couple of bricks, something like that. It doesn't seem to make any sense. But Hume's argument is that's not actually contrary to reason. The view that reason is divorced from value, this fact-value gap, is often assumed to be true by many who claim they're following a scientific view of the world, as well as by many who make the claim that technology in and of itself is morally neutral. It's easy to assume, in fact, that this view is just natural, but this view of reason is not universally held by any means, and what position you take of the complex underlying philosophical debates will make a large difference, both to how you respond to technology in general, but more specifically to how you understand the arguments around how humans might attempt to control superintelligence and how the superintelligence itself might turn out. So, for example, the philosopher Immanuel Kant held that reason is tied intimately to morality, and the notion of reason that Kant held was a teleological notion of reason aimed at certain goals. So that for Kant, as humans, we are rational agents, and this includes an appreciation of the pull of reason itself, and the capacity to recognise and respect other rational agents. And its capacity to recognise, respect other rational agents is a core of morality for Kant. So that for Kant, reason and value are intimately connected. So here are some questions for philosophers. Are intelligence, reason, knowledge independent of value? What motivations would we want our superintelligent overlords, if they ever exist, to have? So, for example, would you want it to be motivated to bring about a world in which there's greatest benefit to us? Although, what does that actually mean? Maybe that would be like the pampered pets world. Would we want it to be motivated, would we want the superintelligence to be motivated to allow us maximum freedom and autonomy, perhaps to fulfill our preferences? Maybe we want it to help us fulfill our preferences. Would we want the AI overlord to fulfill our preferences for ourselves, for us, or do we want to actually do it themselves? More profoundly, we might want to ask whether or not fulfilling preferences is actually the be-all and end-all of morality, or whether there's something beyond the notion of preference and goal fulfillment that underlies moral values. We might want to ask, if we had a world without human beings, what value would there be in that world? So, for example, if we were made extinct, or if we somehow have little AI descendants who are not actually humans but little AIs, Can we create a world that's actually more valuable than the world we have now? Some are arguing from a basic assumption in dealing with superintelligence, as if the basic problem is we want to make certain that the values that humans have continues. That we want humans to continue and to flourish, rather than have a world of machines. But others just label those who hold such views human supremacists. Some things to reflect. Is intelligence really orthogonal to value? Is it really the case that you can be super duper duper intelligent but have absolutely, and it's got no connection whatsoever to value? This is actually an enormous question in ethics, and an enormous question under how we understand not just superintelligence, but artificial intelligence in general. In fact, you might also think it's partly a question of definition, because you might have a view of intelligence that it surely ought, if anything else, to include an appreciation of value. If we're thinking about what goals we might be able to try to build into AI so that they're hopefully still present in any superintelligence, which would be better? A superintelligence that maximizes human welfare, or maximizes satisfaction of preferences, or maximizes something else, or which maybe allows us to have some moral autonomy? In many ways, the novels 1984 and Brave New World, maybe particularly perhaps Brave New World, are also actually really exploring this, because while there's no superintelligence in Brave New World, it's certainly the case that we're imagining a powerful government and powerful technology who's very largely controlling people's lives. And then lastly, would a superintelligence with capacity to acquire knowledge have any knowledge of value? If you had the capacity to acquire knowledge, could you acquire knowledge of value? Is value something which we can find out about, which we can know? These raise really large questions in moral philosophy and metaethics, questions about the epistemology of ethics, questions about how we gain moral knowledge. And those questions are core to many of the questions we need to think about in looking at the ethics of AI. So these questions here, what I'm doing here is just raising questions to introduce these issues in these classes, and later on I hope to make videos examining some of these things in greater depth. And then just to introduce the next class coming up, the third part of his lecture. Don't worry about super smart AI eliminating all the jobs. That's just a distraction from the problems that even relatively dumb computers are causing. So we're going to be looking in next class at some of the problems of control that relatively dumb computers are causing. But although they're relatively dumb, there are many ways in which our lives are already being controlled by AI. So in the next class, that could be described as the problems that even relatively dumb computers are causing, and that even relatively dumb computers have got considerable capacity to control us. Thank you very much for listening.